I have little time left. The words were a dry rasp, lost in the cavernous bedroom where the summer heat had settled like a shroud. Unlee stopped, the spoon of thin broth trembling in her hand. A single drop fell, dark against the worn linen sheets. "Marry me," Jedediah Vance said, his eyes, pale blue and sunk deep in their sockets, fixed on her. "Marry me, and you'll get everything." Everything. The word was an absurdity. Everything was this ranch, the Double V, a kingdom of dust and cattle sprawling across the Wyoming territory. It was the solid timber house built to withstand blizzards and grief. It was the weight of his name in the nearby town of Redemption Creek, a name that could open doors or slam them shut. To Unlee, who was 18 and owned nothing but the faded pink cheongsam on her back and the memory of her father's departing wagon, everything was a concept as distant as the moon. Her father, a laborer for the railroad, had left her in this town with a handful of coins and a promise to send for her. The promise, like the coins, had been spent long ago. She had survived by taking the work no one else would, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, until Dr. Albright, a man with weary eyes and a kind heart, had found her a position nursing the formidable Jedediah Vance. For 6 weeks, she had tended to him. She had bathed his feverish skin, spooned water and broth between his cracked lips, and listened to the ragged rhythm of his breathing in the dead of night. She had learned the geography of his illness, the landscape of his pain. But she knew nothing of the man himself, only that he was rich, alone, and dying. Why? The word was a whisper, spoken in the careful, accented English she had learned at a mission school in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Jedediah's gaze did not waver. It was the most life she had seen in his face for weeks. "Because Marcus Thorne is circling like a vulture. He thinks this land will be his for pennies on the dollar when I'm gone. Because the law protects a widow. It does not protect a dying man's wishes against a man with a paid-off clerk at the land office." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook his entire frame. Unlee instinctively moved to steady him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. His skin was hot, the bones beneath it sharp as kindling. "I am not one of your kind," she said, choosing her words with immense care. It was the plainest truth in the world. In Redemption Creek, she was a ghost, a presence to be ignored or stared at, a splash of worn pink silk in a world of brown wool and denim. The idea of her name next to his on a legal document was unthinkable. "That is precisely the point," Jedediah rasped. "No one will expect it. Thorne won't see it coming." He tried to push himself up on his elbows, a flicker of the strength that must have built this empire, but he fell back against the pillows, exhausted. "I will not let that man pick over my bones. I built this place from nothing. It will not be his." His breath hitched. "I will have the doctor draw up the papers. A legal marriage. You will be Mrs. Vance. When I am gone, the deed will be yours. Free and clear. Do we have an accord?" Unlee looked around the dim room. The heavy oak furniture stood like silent sentinels. Through the open window, she could smell sagebrush and dry earth, the scent of a life she could never have. She thought of the coming winter, of the biting wind and the gnawing hunger she had known before. She thought of the looks she received in town, the way women pulled their children closer as she passed. Jedediah Vance was offering her a shield. A fortress. The price was her name, a ceremony, and the final weeks of a dying man's life. It was not a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between surviving and not surviving. Her hand, still on his shoulder, was steady now. She looked into his pale, desperate eyes and saw not a rancher or a rich man, but a person as trapped as she was. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We have an accord." The ceremony was a quiet, hurried affair. Dr. Albright came, his face a mask of professional neutrality, and the circuit preacher, a nervous young man named Miller, was fetched from town. He stood by Jedediah's bedside, his Bible trembling slightly in his hands. Unlee wore the same pink cheongsam. It was all she had. Jedediah, propped up on a mountain of pillows, answered the vows in a voice that was surprisingly strong, a flicker of defiance in its depths. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was only the sound of the prairie wind rattling the windowpane and the scratch of Jedediah's pen as he signed the new will Dr. Albright had drafted. And Lee, now Mrs. Vance, held the document. The ink was still wet. It felt heavier than a stone, lighter than a feather. It felt like a dream from which she was terrified to wake. Her first trip into Redemption Creek as a married woman was a trial by fire. She needed supplies from the general store, salt and flour and coffee. Ben, the ranch foreman, a quiet, weathered man who had been with Jedediah for 20 years, drove her in the buckboard. He said nothing of the marriage, but he positioned himself near her, a silent, watchful presence. The town felt different. The stares were no longer vacant or curious. They were sharp, pointed, heavy with judgment. Whispers followed her down the boardwalk like stray dogs nipping at her heels. When she stepped into the general store, the low hum of conversation ceased. Every eye was on her. She handed her list to the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, avoiding his gaze. As he gathered the items, a shadow fell over the doorway. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive cigars and cheap cologne. He was a man made of smooth surfaces, from his polished boots to his slicked-back hair. His smile never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice oozing a condescending warmth. "An honor. I must say, marriage seems to have brought a new bloom to your cheeks." And Lee said nothing, keeping her eyes fixed on a sack of beans on the counter. She could feel the heat rising in her face. Thorne took a step closer. "It is a miracle, truly. For weeks, poor Jedediah has been at death's door. And then you arrive, and suddenly he finds the strength for matrimony. You must be a remarkable nurse." The implication was thick and ugly, hanging in the silent store. He was painting her as a predator, a foreign schemer who had somehow tricked a dying man. She could feel the townsfolk listening, their silence a form of agreement. She finally looked up, meeting his cold, assessing gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was quiet and level. "Mr. Vance is a man of strong will." Thorne chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I have no doubt of his will. It's his soundness of mind that has the whole town concerned. A man in his condition, he can be easily influenced." He leaned against the counter, his posture casual, but his presence was an invasion. "You are a long way from home, young lady. A very long way. Things can be complicated out here. For a woman alone." The threat was unmistakable. He was reminding her of her vulnerability, of her otherness. He was telling her that no piece of paper could protect her from what he and this town believed her to be. Before she could find a response, Ben stepped forward from the back of the store, his movement deliberate. He did not look at Thorne. He simply placed a heavy hand on the counter next to Anelli's supplies. "The missus is not alone," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. "And Mr. Vance's business is his own. We'll be taking these things now, Henderson." Thorne's smile tightened. He looked from Ben's stoic face to Anelli's. He had not expected the foreman's quiet loyalty. He tipped his hat with a mock gallantry. "Of course. My apologies. I was only expressing my concern for an old friend." He turned and walked out, leaving a chill in the summer air. The ride back to the ranch was silent. And Lee held herself rigid, the scene replaying in her mind. Jedediah had been right. Thorne was a vulture, and he was not going to be scared away easily. But something else had happened in that store. Ben's simple, unwavering statement had been a shield. It was a loyalty she had not earned, but one that had been given to her because of the name she now carried. Jedediah had foreseen this. He had sent Ben with her not just to drive the wagon, but to stand with her. The thought was a small, steadying warmth in the cold fear that had settled in her chest. What she did not know was that Marcus Thorne had not gone back to his office. He had walked directly to the telegraph station, his polished boots clicking on the boardwalk. The message he sent was short, addressed to a territorial lawyer in Cheyenne. It spoke of undue influence, of a questionable marriage, and of a very large, very valuable estate. That evening, the house was quiet. Jedediah had been sleeping for most of the afternoon, his energy spent. Unli sat by his bedside, mending one of his shirts, the tiny, neat stitches a familiar comfort from her old life. The confrontation in town had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She was Mrs. Vance, but she felt more like an imposter than ever. Jedediah's eyes opened. He watched her for a moment, his gaze lucid. "Ben told me what happened," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Thorn." Unli nodded, not looking up from her sewing. "He was unpleasant." "He is a man who believes that anything he wants should be his," Jedediah said. "He has wanted this land for 10 years." He paused, gathering his strength. "Are you afraid?" She finally met his eyes. Yes, it was the truth. She was terrified. Not of Thorn himself, but of the power he represented. The power to turn a whole town against her, to erase her, to leave her with nothing once again. "Good," Jedediah said, a surprising response. "Fear keeps a person sharp." He gestured with a frail hand toward a small, leather-bound box on his nightstand. "Bring me that." She retrieved the box and handed it to him. His fingers fumbled with the clasp before it sprang open. Unli expected to see a ring, or perhaps some family heirloom. Instead, nestled on the faded velvet lining, was a single, tarnished daguerreotype. It was a portrait of a young woman with tired eyes and a fiercely determined jaw. She looked nothing like Jedediah. "My sister, Eleanor," he said softly. "She came out here before I did, with her husband. He was a good man, but this land broke him. Died of a fever his second winter. Left her with a small homestead claim and 2 children." He traced the outline of the woman's face with a trembling finger. "The town, they weren't kind. A woman on her own was a problem to be solved or a prize to be claimed. Men with their own ambitions tried to force her out. Made her offers that were nothing short of threats. She fought. Lord, how she fought. But in the end, a lawyer with a slick tongue and a forged document took her land. She lost everything. Died a year later, working as a laundress in Cheyenne. The children were sent to an orphanage." His voice was thick with a grief that was decades old but still raw. "I was just a boy, working on a freight line. I had nothing. I couldn't help her. I swore I would never be helpless again. And I swore I would never stand by and watch the world break someone just because they were alone and vulnerable." He looked at Unli, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not as a nurse, or a convenience, or a weapon against his enemy, but as a person. "I see her in you, Unli," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I see that same fight. That same quiet strength. When I saw how you tended to me, with such care, asking for nothing in return, when I heard the whispers in town about the Chinese girl left behind. I saw my sister all over again. This isn't charity. This is a debt. A debt I'm paying to her, through you. I won't let what happened to Eleanor happen to you." The air in the room shifted. The contract between them, once a cold, practical arrangement for survival, was now something else entirely. It was a pact, born of shared loneliness and an old, abiding sorrow. The fear in Aneli's heart did not vanish, but it was joined by a new feeling, something fierce and protective. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for him, and for the memory of a woman she had never met. The next afternoon, 2 riders approached the ranch house. One was the town marshal, a man named Cutler, whose face was perpetually set in a weary frown. The other was Marcus Thorn, who sat his horse with an air of smug triumph. Ben met them on the porch. Unli stood in the doorway behind him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Marshal," Ben said, his voice flat. "Ben," Cutler acknowledged with a nod. He looked past him to unlead him. "I'm here on official business. Mr. Thorn has filed a legal petition with the territorial court concerning the mental competency of Jedediah Vance at the time of your recent marriage." Thorn smiled. "It's a simple matter of protecting a vulnerable member of our community, Marshal. We have affidavits from several concerned citizens." Affidavits from men who owe you money, Thorne. Ben shot back. The court will decide that, Thorne said smoothly. Until a circuit judge can come and perform an evaluation, the law requires that Mr. Vance's estate be placed under temporary oversight to prevent any precipitous transfers of assets. As the primary petitioner, I have been named the temporary executor. The words hit Lee like a physical blow. He was taking control. He had used the law to get what he could not get through intimidation. The marshal looked uncomfortable, but his duty was clear. I need to see Mr. Vance, Cutler said. And Lee stepped forward. He is resting. He is not to be disturbed. Thorne dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. Now, Mrs. Vance. We wouldn't want to be seen as obstructing the law, would we? It would only lend credence to the idea that you have something to hide. He was walking toward the steps, his intention clear. He was going to push his way inside, to violate the sanctity of the home, to stand over Jedediah's bed like the vulture he was. And Lee looked at the marshal's resigned face, at Ben's tense shoulders, and at Thorne's victorious smirk. She had a choice. She could step aside. She could let them in, let the law take its course, and likely be thrown out within the week. Or she could stand her ground. It was the choice Eleanor never had. She moved from the doorway and stood at the top of the 3 porch steps, blocking Thorne's path. She was a small, slight figure in a foreign dress, facing 2 armed and powerful men. You are not welcome in this house, Mr. Thorne, she said. Her voice did not shake. Thorne stopped, surprised by her audacity. This is no longer your decision to make. I am his wife, she said, the words ringing with a truth that went deeper than any legal document. This is my home. You will not enter it. Marshal Cutler sighed, shifting his weight. Please don't make this difficult. But Lee did not move. She planted her feet, a silent, unbreachable wall. She was no longer just the abandoned girl. She was the guardian of a dying man's last wish, the keeper of his dignity. In that moment, standing on the porch of the home he had given her, she was fighting not just for the land, but for the man who had seen a sister's ghost in her eyes and offered her a future. 6 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high plains, a fine white powder over the dormant gold of the prairie grass. The air that came through the windows of the Vance ranch house was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Inside, the home was warm. A fire crackled in the great stone hearth, casting a flickering orange light on the polished wood floors. And Lee moved through the rooms with a quiet, purposeful grace. The faded pink cheongsam was gone, stored away in a chest. She now wore a simple, practical dress of dark blue wool. The legal battle had been short and brutal. When the circuit judge finally arrived, Marcus Thorne had presented his case with oily confidence. He'd brought forth his witnesses, men who mumbled about Jedediah's ramblings and confusion. But Thorne had underestimated 2 people, Dr. Albright, who testified with cold, medical precision about Jedediah's unwavering lucidity, and Jedediah himself. Propped up in a chair brought from the ranch, looking frail but with an iron glint in his eye, Jedediah had systematically dismantled Thorne's claims. He recalled dates, cattle prices, and contractual details with a mind as sharp as a newly honed blade. He spoke of Thorne's predatory lending practices and his long-standing ambition to acquire the Double V. By the time he was done, the judge dismissed the petition in less than 5 minutes. Marcus Thorne left the territorial office a diminished man, his public humiliation costing him more than just the ranch. His reputation for cleverness had been replaced by a reputation for greed and cruelty. Jedediah was not cured. The illness still lived in his bones, a permanent guest. But he was not dying. With the stress of Thorne's threat removed, and with Anelli's steady, patient care, a measure of strength had returned to him. He was no longer confined to his bed. And Lee found him sitting in his worn leather armchair by the fire, mending a piece of bridle leather. His hands, though still thin, were no longer trembling. He worked with a slow, deliberate focus. The ranch was thriving under their strange partnership. Lee managed the household and the accounts with meticulous skill, while Jedediah, from his chair, offered the wisdom of his years, guiding Ben and the other hands. They had discovered a rhythm, a quiet harmony that had transformed the house from a sick room into a home. She placed a steaming mug of tea on the small table beside him. He looked up, his pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners in a soft smile that was now familiar to her. "Thank you, Lee," he said. She sat in the chair opposite him, a comfortable silence settling between them. It was a silence built of shared meals, of quiet evenings, of a battle fought and won together. "The new well held through the first freeze," she said, reporting on the day's news. "And Ben says the hay stores will be more than enough for the winter." "Good," Jedediah nodded. "That's good." He set aside his leatherwork and looked into the fire. "You know," he said, his voice reflective, "when I made my offer to you that day, I was just trying to win. Trying to beat Thorn. Trying to protect my legacy." He turned his gaze to her, and the warmth in it was more potent than the fire. "But that's not what happened. You saved more than just my land, Lee. You gave my life a purpose again. You reminded me what this was all for." He reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and dry, the calloused skin of a man who had worked the earth, the grip of a man holding on to his future. Anneli's fingers curled around his. In this quiet, firelit room, miles from anyone who would judge or question, she was not the poor Chinese girl or the scandalous bride. He was not the dying rancher or the wealthy landowner. They were simply two people who had found in each other an unexpected harbor, a place to build a life against the unforgiving landscape of the West. A home was not a place you found, she realized. It was a shelter you built, hand in hand, with someone you trusted. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.